Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. So, this past week, we had 2 days of hearings regarding the impeachment of President Trump. And over the course of those 2 days, I tried to objectively, although it's somewhat difficult, I tried to objectively listen to what portions of the hearings that I had time to carve out and listen to. And in that portion that I didn't have time to carve out and listen to, I tried to find clips. I tried to read. I really tried to understand from both sides' points of view exactly what was going on in terms of impeachment. As you know from previous podcasts, I've perseverated on this topic quite a bit, but I have so because this is, in terms of some of the constitutional authorities, abilities, constitutional restrictions, impeachment is probably one of the gravest, other than declaring an act of war, obviously. This is one, and in fact, I would almost argue that this is a graver issue than declaring an act of war, because when you declare an act of war, there is generally a bipartisan consensus among all parties that, yes, the United States has been attacked and we need to retaliate and do what is necessary to protect our civilians, to protect our citizens. Some might argue that we have diluted the Congressional Declaration of Wars with the War Powers Act, and that may or may not be true. In fact, I'm not here to argue that. But when you think about a declaration of war, you have a defined enemy, you have a defined purpose, and it takes both houses of Congress to, along with the president, to agree to this. So it's one of those parts of the Constitution that generally, if it occurs because there is some sort of outside threat that says we must take action to defend ourselves. On the other hand, the act of impeachment is probably of graver consequence to the survival of the Republic, to the survival of the Constitution, because it is a rare, in the history of the United States, 4 times now, only 4 times, has it been attempted. Now, there have been numerous other impeachments where federal judges and other officials have either been impeached and removed from office or impeached and not removed from office. But let's focus solely on the presidency, because the impeachment of a president is, in essence, taking away from the power of the people the ability to elect an individual that they have chosen and give that power to the House and the Senate. The House to actually pass the articles of impeachment, and the Senate to actually remove the president from office. That is a significant, when you think about that, that is upending the votes of, in the case of Donald Trump, 65 plus million Americans, upending the votes of at least 270 electoral votes, which is what it takes to win in the Electoral College. And it is the legislative branch of the Congress dipping its power into the executive branch and saying, regardless of what the people did, we have determined that this is of such grave consequence that we are going to overturn the actions of the electorate, and we're going to remove this president. What's really starting to bother me about these proceedings, forgetting about whether they're valid or not valid, is that we are doing this at a time when it's less than a year away from another election. Donald Trump, in less than a year, will either be reelected to another 4-year term, or he will be defeated at the polls in November of 2020. So why the rush to do this now and put the country through what is really a grave constitutional, some would call it a crisis. I don't know that it's a crisis because I don't know that this is going anywhere. But what we're really doing at this point is Congress, or in fact, the Democrats, because there is no bipartisan support. You know, I've always been one of these individuals that says that bipartisanship is way overrated, and that if bipartisanship means continuing to give up your principles, means continuing to give up those things which you believe in order just to reach a compromise, in other words, compromising for the sake of compromise, then I'm opposed to bipartisanship. When it comes to exercising such grave authority as removing a sitting president, I do believe that requires some sort of bipartisan approval. That requires, I think, to some degree, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It doesn't have to be that, in the case of Nixon, where everybody agreed, yes, he has to go, there have actually been crimes committed. But in this case, it is wholly one-sided. And so as it is wholly one-sided, it necessarily divides the American public down these tribal divides that we already have between Republican and Democrat, between conservative and liberal, between left and right, between free markets and Marxism. I mean, however you want to divide the tribes up, it continues to divide the tribes in that way. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time really trying to read as much as I could from both sides of the issue. One, so that I could understand those who are opposed to impeachment, the arguments that they're making. And if you heard my radio program last Friday, I criticized the Republican counsel, not so much for his legal skills, because he may have incredible legal skills, but I thought that he did some serious mistakes with the former Ukrainian ambassador by asking her some open-ended questions that gave her the opportunity to spin some previous answers to make her answers seem, how would I say, that made her answers seem much more damaging than what they truly were. So I went back and I listened to as much of her testimony again, because on Friday night, before Tamara, we were having a late dinner with friends on Friday. So I had the opportunity to again watch the network news. So I decided to watch Norah O'Donnell, primarily because I knew that Norah O'Donnell and CBS News would probably be over the top in their coverage, and they didn't disappoint. Everything was a bombshell. Everything was shocking. There was revealing testimony. It was, if all I listened to were the adjectives that were used in the reporting by Norah O'Donnell and the CBS correspondents, if all I listened to were the adjectives, I would have thought that last Friday was the end of Donald Trump. Then I spent Saturday and Sunday doing a lot of reading, trying to go to all of the liberal websites, both on Facebook, the liberal news sites. Same for the conservatives. I went to the conservative websites. I read those stories. I was, in all honesty, through, and again, trying to, as I've said before on the radio, that if you're going to be a good, if you're a good trial lawyer, you need to understand where the other side's coming from. So I was trying to not only understand where the other side's coming from, but I was also trying to understand from my point of view, are they making a good case, or are there holes in the case that Republicans are making that would cause me to say, well, okay, so maybe this is a stronger case than I expected. And then I finally, and this wasn't by design, this was just the way it turned out, I finally got to the Wall Street Journal. And I don't know why it was the last that I read, but the Wall Street Journal was the last news site that I went to before I started the recording of this podcast. And I found two articles. The first article is entitled, "Republicans and Anonymous Get It Wrong. GOP panelists," the subtitle says, "didn't know what to do at the hearings, and the author seems not to be playing it straight." The reference to Anonymous is a book that's going to be published Monday or Tuesday by a, quote, air quote here, high-ranking Trump administration official. which in the parlance of Washington, D.C., doesn't mean squat. Anybody who has any title, deputy assistant, assistant to the assistant, assistant to the assistant to the assistant of anything in the West Wing, is considered a high-ranking administration official. And in fact, for that matter, any cabinet secretary, deputy secretary, or undersecretary, WA, is considered a high-ranking administration official. So the author of this particular opinion piece, Republicans and Anonymous Get It Wrong, is by one of my favorite writers. Not because I often or very often or infrequently agree or disagree with her, but because of her writing style, and that's former Reagan speechwriter Peggy Noonan. So Peggy is the author of the story, opinion piece, Republicans and Anonymous Get It Wrong. My other favorite writer on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal is Kimberly Strassel. And Kimberly Strassel, Strassel, I always pronounce her last name wrong, Kimberly Strassel, has also written an opinion piece called Impeachment as Usual. And her subtitle is, Democrats have managed to turn a grave process into a duly partisan one. And then the Wall Street Journal has a kind of tit for tat, this for that, back and forth between Republicans and Democrats about the impeachment effort. And it goes like this.
It seems to me that the President of the United States either committed extortion and bribery of a foreign official or attempted extortion and bribery of a foreign official.
The committee's investigation has uncovered a web of shadow diplomacy.
Ambassador Bolton and Mick Mulvaney both spoke directly to President Trump, and unlike you, they have refused to honor our request for them to be a part of these proceedings.
In the blink of an eye, we're asked to simply forget about Democrats on this committee, falsely claiming they had more than circumstantial evidence of collusion between President Trump and Russians.
If we find that the President of the United States abused his power and invited foreign interference in our elections,
we should forget about them reading fabrications of Trump-Russia collusion from the Steele dossier.
Or if he sought to condition, coerce, extort, or bribe an ally into conducting investigations to aid his reelection campaign and did so by withholding official acts.
And forget about countless other deceptions, large and small, that make them the last people on earth with the credibility to hurl more preposterous accusations at their political opponents.
Must we simply get over it?
Let me read it one more time. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019 in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. We got 6 people having 4 conversations in one sentence, and you just told me this is where you got your clear understanding.
Number one, he still refuses to hear from the whistleblower, which started off this whole process.
I wonder if you could explain to the American people why the legal rights of the whistleblower should prevail in this political setting over those of President Trump, who should ordinarily enjoy a right to confront his accuser.
Well, let me just say this. I'd say to you, Mr. Republican Talking Points, what I said to the President of the United States. The whistleblower is there to speak truth to power and have protection for doing that. Vehemently. Well, the President can come, and if he has a case to make, does he want to come speak?
Number 2, in less than 20 minutes, Adam Schiff interrupted Republicans' questions.
Are you Parliamentary Inquiry, are you seriously interrupting our time here?
I will allow the question. I won't dock this from the time. In questions from the majority or the minority that may assume facts not in evidence before you, you should be cautioned about that.
USMCA needs to be called up for a vote in the House. We regretfully still don't have a way forward on funding the government. And also, we understand the Democrats on the conference on NDAA are slow-walking that. Clearly, they are so obsessed with the impeachment exercise that they cannot bring themselves to do the basic work of government.
And I think that the Wall Street Journal summed it up pretty well. You can listen to both sides, and if all you listen to is your own side, you become cemented in one position or another. I'm cemented in a position. I'm cemented in a position that says, at this point, the Democrats have not shown an impeachable offense. I'm also cemented in a position that many Americans who are cemented in a position that this president has committed an impeachable offense are committed to that position primarily because of their dislike of the president. And this president has a lot about which to dislike. Many people don't like the way he acts, the way he tweets, the way he speaks, the way he talks to other individuals. They don't like, everything from misogyny to racism to Islamophobia to, every pejorative that you can think of, they have attached to this president. I could go through each one of those, and I could make a case that he is none of those things. But because of some of the things that he has said that may not rise to the level of those things, I could certainly make, I think, a somewhat reasonable or persuasive argument that if you only listen to the words or you only read the words, that you could infer that the president is those things. Although I happen to believe that it requires taking words and actions out of context to reach that conclusion. Nonetheless, I understand that if you are predisposed to that position, that's the position that you would find yourself in. Likewise, I understand that there are people on the other side of the aisle who, regardless of the words, in fact, some people I would argue that let's take, for example, his tweet about the ambassador while she was testifying. I think that from a political point of view and a legal point of view was a unforced error. That was a stupid mistake on his part. Yet there are some people who would say, good for him, because while she was testifying, he tweeted out how bad of an ambassador she was. She certainly may have been a bad ambassador. In fact, I'm not impressed with some of the things that she did while she was the Ukrainian ambassador or the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. But she is what she is. So I'm not going to argue the merits of her. I'm simply saying that by him tweeting in the middle of that testimony, he probably gave fodder to those who were already cemented over here on the other side. He gave them additional ammunition. And those over here who believe that he has done nothing were forced to get off their strategy, were forced to get off their battle plan, and then go defend something that but for his tweeting, nobody would have ever known about or cared about or heard about, and we wouldn't have had that additional error, to put it back in baseball terms. We wouldn't have had that penalty during the hearing. But let's go back to the Wall Street Journal, because I think if we just go to the beginning of both of the articles, you'll understand where the difference is. Peggy Noonan in the second paragraph, and let me just go through the first two paragraphs. I want you to have the full context. She writes, a young foreign affairs professional asked last week if the coming impeachment didn't feel like Watergate. He was a child during that scandal, I in college. I said no. Watergate had the feeling of real drama. It was a reckoning with who we were as a people. It felt grave. This is more like the Clinton impeachment, grubby and small. But, she says, watching the first day of hearings, I thought that wasn't quite right. There was something grave in it and a kind of reckoning. This was due. Now, she's about to tell you why she thinks that the impeachment hearings that she watched last week went from small and grubby, like the Clinton impeachment, to something that was grave and a sort of reckoning. And she says the reason was this was due to the dignity and professionalism of the career diplomats who calmly and methodically told what they had seen and experienced. They were believable, she writes. It didn't feel embarrassing to have faith in them. And she continues that Republicans on the panel didn't know what to do. They know what this story is, and I believe they absolutely know the president muscled an ally, holding public money over its head to get a personal political favor. But they're his party. They didn't want to look weak. They had to show the base they had his back. In their interruptions and chaos strewing, they attempted to do some of what the Democrats did during the Kavanaugh hearings, only without the screaming meanies of Code Pink. So Peggy Noonan tries to say that the Republicans, or that the diplomats, brought about a grave and serious dignity and professionalism to the hearings. Well, they may have been erudite. They may have been very elusive and articulate in the language that they used. But if you listen to what they said, it was hollow. It was meaningless. They were only repeating third, fourth, and fifth-hand hearsay. There was no substance. Even when the Ukrainian ambassador was asked if she had evidence of any crime committed by the president, her answer was no. If she had any evidence of any bribery committed by the president, her answer was no. And if she had any evidence of any impeachable offense committed by the president, her answer was no. End of story. End of hearings, in my opinion. But Peggy Noonan, taking the side of those on the tribes that want to think that this is grave and serious, I think it's grave and serious. I think it's grave and doing serious damage to the country. Because if you don't like Donald Trump, and I mean this very sincerely, if you don't like Donald Trump, you have an opportunity in less than 12 months to remove him from office by exercising that most basic of right of Americans to go to the polls and vote. So why are we doing this now? Because without evidence of a serious high crime and misdemeanor, you are taking away the ability of Americans to make their choice known next November. Now, let me just put a footnote in right here. I think all of this is meaningless, only in this sense. I think it's very meaningful because I think we're abusing the Constitution for political reasons. We're abusing the impeachment process for political reasons, and I think that sets up a horrible precedent. If Republicans play the same game, I hope I'm around when they do so I can criticize them for doing it, absent any meaningful evidence of an impeachable offense. But I think what bothers me the most is that sacred right of electing that president in November or removing him from office is the most basic of the principles of this republic. That we get to elect the chief executive, that we get to elect the commander-in-chief, and that only should that person be removed for a serious crime, for a serious abuse of office. And we haven't seen that. Peggy Noonan, though, wants to convince me in the Wall Street Journal that because of the seriousness and the way the diplomats talked, that, oh my gosh, this is serious business. But then we go to Kimberly Strassel. And she starts out this way. Democrats have already lost their impeachment battle. That's the takeaway from Wednesday's first public hearing. What was meant to be a moment in history turned out to be business as usual. Democrats, she writes, laid out their best case for removing Donald Trump from office, repeatedly using words like extortion, bribery, and abuse of power. Mr. Trump was accused of presidential misconduct, of a shakedown scheme, and of corruption. He was said to have broken the law and violated the Constitution. Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro analogized the president's actions to, quote, attempted murder. That's hyperbole of the worst kind. So after having listened to both sides, I find myself in a really frustrated position. Congress has the right, if they believe that this president has committed impeachable offenses, to hold an impeachment inquiry, to vote on articles of impeachment, and because they have a majority in the House, absent some statesman standing up and saying that, no, I do not believe an impeachable offense was proven by these hearings, those articles will get passed and sent over to the Senate where they will die. And the president will not be removed. And the president will instead have endured one more period of time in which the nation is told by the talking heads, told by the Democrats, countered by the Republicans, that it's all about Donald Trump. This country's so much more than about Donald Trump. But what we're witnessing, I believe, is an abuse of power by the Democrats. I told you I was cemented in my position. And my position is this. I have not seen the evidence of an impeachable offense yet. If and when I see that, I don't care how dignified the diplomats are. I don't care how stoic the Ukrainian ambassador was. All of that is the kind of stuff that if you're just looking at the surface, sure, the diplomats spoke in diplomatic language. One of them even wore a bow tie. Oh, looked like a Harvard professor. But that's meaningless. I want the substance of what was said. And in the substance of what was said, there was not an impeachable offense. Now, I'll continue to listen. And I'll continue to watch. And I guarantee you this, that if and when I start to see a crack, oh yes, if this is true, then yes, we need further inquiry into that line of questioning. But until then, my theory is this. Impeachment is, and as I've said in previous podcasts, is a political process. But it's a political process that is to be used when the decision of the people with regard to the commander-in-chief that they have elected needs to be taken out of the hands of the people because of high crimes and misdemeanors, corruption, or abuse of power. That's when Congress uses the impeachment power. They don't use it for political purposes to try to weaken a president less than a year before his election. That's what's going on. If that changes or I see something different, I'll tell you that. I don't know whether you have access to the Wall Street Journal or not, but if you have the opportunity, I would encourage you to read side by side Peggy Noonan and Kimberly Strassel, two excellent writers. One focusing on substance, unfortunately Peggy focusing on style. I'll talk to you tomorrow.